Hi, Kevin, and a good morning or good evening to everyone, wherever in the world you are. I'm going to just begin with a set of framing remarks before the Spanish Inquisition by Kevin Wright. Let me begin with three Ds: disease, digitalization, and the divide between the two superpowers. First, very quickly, on disease. COVID-19 is now endemic. It's permanent. It's going to circulate and recirculate in humanity for a very long time, if not forever. Unlike SARS 18 years ago, COVID has spread globally, and we now know that human immunity wanes over time. That means it will get to recirculate. It will also get to generate new mutations, new variants. Vaccination will certainly help to reduce severe disease and mortality, and we have data for that. And what this means is that at some point in time, when human beings collectively have built up enough immunity, either through infection or through vaccination, we will have to learn to live with the virus. The question is, how many lives will be lost, and many unnecessarily, before we get to that modus vivendi with the virus? And there will be secondary questions on the scars that this pandemic will leave on social cohesion within societies, on the economic potential of our own economies, on political legitimacy of the ruling classes, and whether human beings, nationally and collectively, will be prepared for the inevitable next pandemic. My second framing point is on digitalization. And really, when you talk about digitalization, this is something that's layered on top of globalization. The digital revolution was well underway before COVID-19 even came onto the scene. In Southeast Asia alone, we now have 400 million internet users, and this is growing. We also have a rapidly growing digital economy, which is expected to triple in the next 5 years to over 300 billion US dollars. Digitalization and globalization really are two forces that reinforce one another, and especially here in Asia. So we will certainly see a positive impact. There will be new jobs, there will be new forms of economic activity. And the digital marketplaces, for instance, now enable small businesses outside traditional urban centers in Southeast Asia to reach even more customers. And work can be more flexible. And in a paradoxical way, COVID-19, in fact, turbocharged flexible work schedules and arrangements. For Singapore, technology and its integration into our lives has been a key tool in our response to COVID-19. And this is whether to support safe distancing measures, contact tracing, or to get accurate and reliable information out very quickly. But I think we should also be very clear-eyed. There are significant challenges due to the speed of globalization, the porous digital borders, the pandemic of misinformation, which arguably has sometimes been worse than the pandemic itself. And misinformation is now one of the biggest challenges in tackling COVID-19, and especially with these digitally enhanced echo chambers, which are fracturing our societies. We've also witnessed culture wars spreading across borders. We've witnessed xenophobia accelerated. We've seen deepening social, ethnic, and religious divisions. So all these digital channels, in fact, amplify demagoguery in our politics. So we need to ask ourselves, will digitalization make us all one happy global village? Or will it, in fact, divide us into tribes, living in our own echo chambers, in a state of permanent outrage? Will digitalization bring greater wealth to all or greater inequality? And can we democratize the digital tools of production and then create a new golden age? Or will we have to go through a gilded age of greater inequality with all the political dislocation and disruption that entails? My third point is that in Southeast Asia, these trends sit uncomfortably across a fault line. The divide the strategic rivalry, especially between the US and China. The fundamental question, to quote Henry Kissinger, my favorite tutor in diplomacy, is whether the US and China will achieve creative coexistence. I'll repeat that, creative coexistence, or will they fall into Graham Allison's Thucydides trap? And again, to paraphrase Kissinger, avoiding an all-out, high-tech, catastrophic conflict is necessary and attainable, but it is not automatic. China is a civilizational state that has existed for millennia. Its fortunes may wax and wane over the long arc of history, but it has never disappeared and it will not disappear. America, on the other hand, has never faced a peer strategic rival on such a scale since independence 245 years ago. So China will continue its march towards economic and technological prowess and will naturally seek to reclaim what it sees as its rightful place in the world. I believe the United States is still ahead by a not insignificant distance. But as we move towards a multipolar world, it would be a mistake to assume that the US is a declining power. It is not. Neither the US nor China seek a collision. But the sense of it is that neither is prepared to risk ceding strategic ground at the moment. And so for the rest of us, the challenge is how do we navigate the complexities of this fast evolving, volatile US-China relationship, and especially with the prospect of bifurcated supply chains and technological decoupling occurring in the short term. There are encouraging signs that both sides are willing to work together in areas of common interest. And indeed, we hope that they do arrive at a modus vivendi, especially where global leadership is so urgently needed. And the clear examples in front of us, COVID-19, climate change. Let me now turn to a current hotspot in my immediate neighborhood, Myanmar. It continues to be roiled by mass protests and a bloody crackdown after the coup. Many of us here, I think, had hoped, and perhaps wishfully, that Myanmar was on the road to democratic transition. But I think what is clear now is that, in fact, what we witnessed over the last decade was really an uneasy power-sharing arrangement between the military on one hand and the civilians led by Daw Aung San Suu Kyi on the other hand. And clearly, this power-sharing arrangement has now gone off the rails. This instability is worsened by the serious economic disruption caused by COVID-19. There are now shortages of food, medical supplies, and energy. We don't know how much testing, much less vaccination, is being done. Healthcare workers are on strike. And all this is occurring at a time when COVID-19 is on an exponential rise throughout Asia. So although the headlines have focused on the political upheaval, we should not forget the very serious humanitarian situation that is now unfolding on the ground. Technology and information have also played an outsized role within Myanmar. The protesters share news, they organize over social media, the diaspora raises money through crowdfunding, despite the military attempts to curtail internet access. Taken together, all these point towards a protracted crisis that will not be resolved quickly, and it will impact regional stability. Singapore's position has been clear and consistent throughout. We strongly oppose the use of lethal force against unarmed civilians. It's deplorable, it's unacceptable under any circumstances. The military authorities must exercise restraint, and they must desist from further bloodshed and violence. President Win Myint and the State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi and other political detainees must be released so that all stakeholders can negotiate in good faith to find a durable and peaceful political solution. And these negotiations must involve all key stakeholders, including the Tatmadaw, the military authorities, which has always been a key institution, and the National League for Democracy, which clearly commands popular support, and all the ethnic groups. So we continue to support regional and international efforts to maintain constructive engagement and dialogue within Myanmar. The return to Myanmar's path of democratic transition, frankly, it'll be a long, difficult, and tortured journey. There are deep religious and racial fault lines which run across 8 major ethnic races, 135 official ethnic groups. And yes, there was unprecedented political liberalization during the last decade. But even then, we're all painfully aware it was always delicate and precarious. But ultimately, Myanmar's future must be for its own people in Myanmar to decide. The rest of us must and can support and facilitate negotiations. We can help the stakeholders uphold and protect the fragile process of national reconciliation and peace. But let's ask ourselves, honestly, where does this leave us? How do we go forward? For the international community, I would offer 2 principles. First, do no harm. Second, protect the vulnerable. A key outcome of the recent ASEAN leaders meeting was the 5-point consensus, which underscored the importance of exercising maximum restraint and the need for meaningful dialogue with all parties concerned. And the Myanmar military authorities, represented by Senior General Ming Online, who was present at that meeting, agreed to it. We now have to work on implementing this consensus, including through nominating an ASEAN special envoy or envoys and arranging for them to engage all the relevant parties in Myanmar. At the same time, we must also deal with the acute impact of the instability, including the future of those displaced by violence and the looming food and humanitarian crisis. Frankly, our past attempts to isolate Myanmar have had very little impact, except to make life harder for ordinary people. An isolated military in the past always fell back on those willing to work with them for strategic reasons. And remember that Myanmar is between India and China, and they seem prepared to do so again. But the international community still plays an important role. The military, to be fair, has shown some willingness, at least to continue engaging ASEAN. Our dialogue partners and the United Nations can play a constructive role in complementing ASEAN's efforts. And our common purpose now must be to support Myanmar's return, hopefully, to stability and normalcy. For the wider Southeast Asian region, we must not allow this single issue, important and painful as it is, to completely impede ASEAN's substantive cooperation with external partners across the entire spectrum of our agenda. We still need effective international cooperation to deal with the immediate threat from COVID-19, vaccine multilateralism to support equitable and timely access to the vaccine is essential. We need to help each other secure medical supplies, diagnostic test kits, oxygen, life-saving equipment. We need scientific cooperation to address the new variants and to contain the viral spread. And we need to do all this while reforming multilateral institutions like the WHO, the United Nations, in order to prepare for the next pandemic and to prepare for a post-pandemic world. On the economic side, we need to press on with economic integration, supply chain connectivity. We've got to keep essential goods flowing across borders. And we need the protocols to reopen travel safely when the conditions improve. Our region is already moving ahead to develop standards and rules for these issues of the day, for supply chain resilience, for digital and green economies, as well as data connectivity and security. One point I want to emphasize at this point is that it is important for the United States to actively participate in setting the norms and the standards for tomorrow's industries, and to exercise global thought leadership just as it has over the past 7 decades. In the longer term, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership have laid the foundation for wider and deeper economic convergence across Asia. These two agreements will shape the geostrategic landscape for years to come, with or without the US participation. So the key is to look at Southeast Asia with a future-oriented perspective. The demographics, the digital trends, the opportunities from sustainable development. Over half of ASEAN's 660 million people today are below the age of 30. This is a growing consumer base and expanding tech-savvy digital native generation. And in fact, many people may not even realize that ASEAN has now overtaken the EU to become China's largest trading partner. And ASEAN is the United States' fourth largest export market. In the digital space alone, there are many opportunities for the United States tech companies to engage ASEAN to develop the future economy based on smart manufacturing, blockchain applications, education, AI, robotics, digital health, the whole spectrum. So to conclude, there is a bright future for ASEAN, but there are also huge downside risks. We remain a very diverse region in terms of history, ethnicity, religion, language. ASEAN has managed to flourish for over half a century, despite the Cold War, and in fact, especially after the Cold War. In the next half century, those of us living in ASEAN hope to avoid becoming an arena for the proxy confrontations of the superpowers. We know the outcome does not depend on us alone, but we will do our best to stay united, to be relevant, and to remain an open, inclusive, rules-based region replete with opportunities. So let me stop there and thank you for this opportunity to be with you, and I look forward to Kevin's inquisition. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Minister, and thank you for joining us at the Asia Society. I think you know you're always a welcome guest with us, and I'd also acknowledge your former senior diplomat and continuing senior diplomat, Heng Chi Chan, who is our global co-chair of the Asia Society, who is, of course, with you in Singapore. I listened very carefully to the 3 Ds, the disease, digitization, the geopolitical divide. There's probably a 4th D, which is democracy in Myanmar. Yes. And so on the 3 or 4 Ds, would you give ASEAN an A+, an A-, or a B+ so far in handling these regional challenges? How goes the institution, I suppose, is in terms of wrestling with all of the above? Let me begin with that.
That's an excellent probe. I think first we've made it through 5 decades, and the first characteristic of ASEAN is I cannot think of any other regional organization with such great diversity in terms of size, in terms of economic development, even in terms of forms of government. And the differences between us are enormous. So the fact that we've been able to stay united, in fact, over the last 5 decades, we've also included Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and obviously Myanmar. Just being there, being relevant, is success in itself. We haven't had open conflict amongst the members within ASEAN. We've been able to maintain convening power to engage all the superpowers and the middle powers. And as the Prime Minister or the former Prime Minister of Australia, you know that we did our bit to integrate Australia into our own regional architecture. So in that sense, we've done reasonably well. Could we have moved faster? Possibly. I think certainly in terms of economic integration, lowering trade barriers, we could have done it faster. But if you look in terms of the multilateral trade agreements that we have spawned or been a part of, the RCEP, which I mentioned earlier, and those of us who are also members of the TPP, you can see the nascent development really of a free trade area of the Asia Pacific. So on that front, in terms of economic integration, I think we've also done well. We do have problems, and the clear example now is Myanmar. But even in the case of Myanmar, I mean, I've done this thought experiment. Would it have been better for Myanmar and for ASEAN if they were not within ASEAN? Or has it, on balance, been difficult but beneficial for them to have been part of ASEAN, for them to have a channel of engagement and a certain amount of peer moral suasion to be applied, rather than to be completely detached and cut off and isolated from the rest of the world? So it's a mixed record, but I think in terms of peace, in terms of economic development, and even in terms of diplomacy, we've played a useful role. As far as Singapore is concerned, to us, ASEAN is a cornerstone of our foreign policy.
It's I've been a huge supporter of ASEAN for the reasons you've outlined, Minister, and also
we're grateful. And I need to say, I'm grateful to you. You know, I mean, you certainly played a critical role, and you were leading Australia.
But there's a reason for that, which is you've done well, given the extraordinary complexity of the background. Go back prior to the 60s, we had all sorts of troubles within the region. So when people criticize ASEAN, I always ask, a bit like yourself, engage in the thought experiment. What if there was no ASEAN? Where would Southeast Asia be today? And I think that partly answers the question. And on the Myanmar question, which we'll come back to in a minute, I mean, the fact that you've maintained cohesion, and secondly, you've still had strong voices nationally from Singapore, from Malaysia, from Indonesia and others about the unacceptability of the use of military force. I mean, these voices have been very important in the international community as well. Let's go to the first D, which is the disease. In the Foreign Minister's trilogy, you had a few rough times in Singapore, but overall, against global benchmarking, Singapore has been remarkably successful. I know you've just had to take a difficult decision on the cancellation of Shangri-La, but so have many countries with comparably significant global gatherings. But as you look out across the region beyond Singapore, where you've handled it well, if I was to ask you to put your crystal ball in front of you and give us a sense of where you think the disease will be across Southeast Asia, say by the time we were to gather again at the end of the year, give me a sense of how you think the trajectory is going. Particularly money makers.
It is crystal ball gazing. And if it's one thing COVID-19 has taught us, is that this is a very wily, almost sentient and smart virus. So let's go back to the fundamentals. I said earlier it's endemic, which means it's a permanent resident in humanity. In the case of SARS, which was another coronavirus, it petered out because it was far less contagious than COVID-19. We do know COVID-19 is more contagious. We do know almost half of people are asymptomatic and yet can still be contagious. We do know that because it is global and because it has millions of human beings in which to replicate and to mutate and to generate new variants, and that human immunity wanes over time, we in fact have a perfect petri dish to keep generating new variants. And you don't need to be a doctor to know that new variants usually evolve towards becoming more infective, more contagious. So what this means, my own assessment at a global level, is we're going to be stuck with this for at least the next 2 years. Things are going to get worse before they get better. But on the plus side, the incredible development of vaccines, the pace of development of vaccines and the rollout. In the case of Singapore now, we've completed 2-dose vaccinations for more than a quarter of our population. If you count those who've received at least the first dose, it's a third of the population. Now, over the next 1 or 2 years, the overall level of immunity in humanity is going to increase either by infection or by vaccination. What that means is you will then have COVID being a smoldering ember. It's not going to be put away permanently, but it will be there, it'll come back, it'll probably be seasonal. But if its mortality rate begins to approximate that of influenza, you don't shut down and lock up societies in the case of influenza. But we've had to, at this stage of COVID-19, because so many of us are immunologically naive to it, and the biggest risk is that the total number of patients exceeds the healthcare capacity of your system. So I think the two curves will intersect sometime in the next 1 or 2 years. And then you can look forward to a post-COVID world where we will not eliminate COVID, but we will live with COVID. And then at that point, the question is how we did and how we performed during that stress test will affect our competitive position, meaning which ones of us were able to not panic, to do what needed to be done, to exercise social capital and social discipline, to not panic in a crisis, to maintain open channels, particularly of logistics and transit, to be reliable and to be good for our word when we sign contracts, and to more quickly apply, especially digital technologies, to deal with these current challenges. So the post-COVID world will have some reordering of the competitive pecking order. So in a way, I'm conveying to you what we are playing for the long game as well. Our current challenge, this is not the first or the last setback, but it will get better, and we do intend to emerge in a stronger position after that. And we will work with our partners and our friends, and especially clearly in this region, and with Australia and New Zealand, and we'll wait for the United States also to get back into the saddle in this part of the world.
Yeah, the endemic nature of it is a critical takeout message in your remarks this evening. I know you've been speaking about this more broadly, but I don't think the international community has fully registered that fact yet, nor the fact that the future virus curve can still be manageable, given what happens with vaccinations, but also with natural immunity factors. Let's go to the second D, which was digitization. You already touched on that in your remarks just then. But in the broader sense of digitization and the enormous explosion of digital commerce around the world, Southeast Asia, around the world, and it turbocharged by what we've seen in the last 15 months.
Yes.
As you said, it's kind of bringing forward the future in many respects. When we look at the state of, let's call it global trade, which is a sorry story at the moment in terms of policy settings, the WTO has been in some retreat. The Americans stayed outside of Trans-Pacific Partnership. The RCEP has proceeded without the United States. And let's see where FTAP, to complete our trilogy of acronyms, takes us.
Yeah.
Is it possible, on your digital point, Minister, to conceive of a world where we begin to work with the Americans, for example, on a digital commerce part of TPP and bring the Americans in? My colleague Wendy Cutler has been working on this in the Asia Society. She's formerly with USTR. But have you given this some thought yourself?
We have. Actually, if you look at global trade volumes itself, I mean, it's actually grown, it's continued to grow. And even during COVID-19, if I look at our air freight and even our marine container traffic, there is still growth there are still good prospects there. The problem with trade really right now is a political one. I think too many of us, took it for granted that free trade is good. Free trade will lift all boats. All segments of society will do well. And we didn't pay enough attention to the domestic impact of that, which basically meant uplifting the productive and competitive capacity of our own local populations to deal with this brave new. So what I'm saying is that the real problem is political. And once you understand that the problem is domestic politics, you sort of understand why the United States could not go through with the TPP. And right now, I don't want to name names and make it awkward for people, but anyone whom you have a heart-to-heart serious conversation with you will not argue about the strategic reasons for the TPP or why America should be engaged. But no one can solve the political problem, which is to convince your domestic voters that this is the right thing to do. So it's a political problem. Now, your suggestion is one which we completely agree with. In fact, that we have digital agreements clearly with Australia, with New Zealand, and we are looking. In the same way, even the TPP started off with New Zealand, Singapore, Chile, and Brunei, and then grew. We are hoping to grow a series of interlocking digital economy agreements. And we're also looking for green economy agreements, carbon markets, standard setting, environmental rules. All these, we believe, would hopefully be less politically explosive, maybe might even enjoy political support, and allow us in that way to create a new architecture in which America can engage with us more quickly. And again, play the role it used to play. I mean, the Bretton Woods organizations, the WTO, the concept of liberal economies, free trade, all these were very, envisioned, underwritten, and pursued under American thought leadership. And it would be a pity for America to be absent at a time when we are formulating standards and norms and rules of engagement on the digital economy and the green economy. So I completely agree with you, Kevin.
Let me flick back from a C to a D to a C. You've touched on the C, which is climate. What are our prospects across Southeast Asia and the rest of East Asia to move towards a target of carbon neutrality by mid-century? And what are the steps you think we need to take to do that? We've had the commitments from the Northeast Asians, China differently, by 2060. Yes. We've had the Americans and the Europeans. What's your own view about the desirable trajectory for Southeast Asia, and how do you think we could get there?
Well, I look at it in three ways. First, at the technical level, all the technology needed to get us to a reasonably carbon neutral world has already been invented. It's a question of execution, implementing, rolling it out. That's from the technical point of view. From the economic point of view, look, actually there's a simple solution. If we could all get to a global, uniform, comprehensive carbon tax, or at least to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, and then allow the economic logic to apply. Economics and technology would lead us to a much greener world. The third dimension of it is a political one. And on this front, I'm glad to report that I think young people in Australia, in Singapore, in Europe, in fact, anywhere in the world, the green movement is powerful and well. And that's why, I was involved with the Paris Agreement. I was from 2011 to 2015, served as a ministerial facilitator for many of the thorny issues. But one big issue, which I'm very glad we pushed, was transparency. Meaning, even if your government was not yet ready to make commitments, but having global transparency and then subjecting each government to the scrutiny of your own local domestic voters would also have a salutary effect. So I'm actually reasonably hopeful that, there's no question of that direction the world will move in. It's only a question now of how quickly we do so, and whether we can work effectively on a global scale in order to achieve it. Because this is the pressing challenge of our generation. And fortunately, our young people will, I think, put our feet to the coals, literally, if we don't move quickly enough.
Yes, there won't be just one Greta. There'll be Gretas in every country, and these Gretas will become increasingly mobilized. And my own attitude is that that's a very good thing.
Yes.
But that it keeps the flame to our feet. Going back to your framework, the geopolitical divide and the 2,000-pound gorillas in our wider region, China and the United States. You and I have discussed this many times in the past, and the analytics are fairly clear, the policy less so, about how we bring about a reconciled future, if we can, Kissingerian alternatives or Allisonian alternatives, as you described before. Tell me, if you're able, on behalf of ASEAN or on behalf of Singapore, to sit down with the Chinese and the Americans in a room about how to navigate this complex decade ahead, which, in order to maximize ASEAN's interests and to our wider region's interests, how would you explain the position to our friends in DC and our friends in Beijing?
Well, I would probably start by recounting my personal experience. And again, to come back to Paris 2015. It was the fact that we had the Americans and the Chinese in the room. And I can speak from direct experience. I was there. When the two of them are in the room and on the same wavelength, everything is possible. And it was done. So it's not that it hasn't been done before. Now, at the risk of being diplomatically incorrect, what I would want to tell my American friends is that the greatest misconception you could have, or the greatest strategic mistake you could make, would be to assume that China will collapse. And the second strategic mistake is to presume that you can convert China. On the other hand, and this I have said to my Chinese colleagues, the biggest mistake China can make would be to assume that America is a declining power and down and out. Now, if the two superpowers can avoid these blind spots, and if they can accept Kissinger's admonition that conflict or war between these two gorillas are unthinkable, and avoiding it is possible but not automatic, then certain things flow from that. I think it's good that they met in Anchorage. It's good that they actually let out steam in Anchorage. I mean, if nothing else, a robust discussion, even publicly, followed by hopefully more restrained but candid conversations behind closed doors, I think can lead us to a better world. So I'm still hopeful that good sense will prevail. But the other dimension to this is domestic politics, you see. And, Kevin, I mean, you've lived or you've been traveling to America for well over a decade now. You know that the bipartisan animus is real and is changed from a decade ago. Similarly, you may say China is not a democracy, but they do have domestic political opinion to contend with. And I do worry if leaders become boxed in by nationalistic forces, which sometimes they wittingly or unwittingly unleash, and it ends up painting both sides into two different corners. So it's, look, it's very easy for you and me to talk about it, to analyze it, but we're not in the driving seat. And that's why I said ultimately the decisions will not be made here. It'll be made in Washington and in Beijing. But the rest of us have got a lot of skin in the game. Because if they get it right, we will then have a golden age, amplified by digital technologies, scientific advancement progressing at exponential rates because it's the entire world working off a common technological and application stack. And we can use all that to solve climate change, to deal with pandemics, to reduce inequality and raise the productive capacity of our people all over the world. So that's what I hope for. I just hope it's not wishful thinking. I suspect I'm very much on your wavelength, Kevin.
I think that's true. I mean, I do worry about a lot about the fatalism I encounter in various parts of the world, including in the United States and to some extent in China, on the thucidity and unavoidability. I'm in the process of authoring a book myself, which is entitled The Avoidable War, for the simple reason it's called human agency, it's political agency. It's what governments and politics.
Yes, but Kevin, there was an avoidable war. It's called World War I.
Yeah, exactly.
And none of the leaders party to that, when they started out on their journey, I think planned for World War I.
Absolutely.
But they ended up on a path-dependent course for disaster. Yeah. So there is real danger.
The book I'd commend to everybody is Sleepwalkers, which is the analysis of the events of 1914. And I know it's one that haunts many of us as we see some evidence of sleepwalking, but parallel to that, a sense of almost fatalism as well, as opposed to human agency. Before we go to questions, one final point on US-China. My observation is the Biden administration probably needs to do more to re-engage Southeast Asia. I'm just looking at it from afar. They've only been in office for 100 days and a bit. You've seen a lot of activity in Northeast Asia, a lot of activity with the NATOs, a lot of activity on climate. I don't expect you to say something undiplomatic about the Americans, but it's been a difficult few years. I think it would be good to see them back across the board. So don't know if you have any reflections on that question.
Well, we know the key players in the Biden administration well. Yeah. And I think they know me and they know us well enough to know that we'll always give it to them straight. Look, there's a lot on their in tray. And, it may be that we're not the squeaky wheel that needs grease at this point in time. But to be fair, and I've spoken to Blinken, to Jake Sullivan, Kurt Campbell has been very active. They know that Southeast Asia is of strategic importance and of growing importance. And they have assured us that they will be present, they will play a role, and we'll give them some time to get that act on the road. So I'm not saying this facetiously or to flatter them. It's just that I understand there are many things going on in the world. And I also understand that, in fact, President Biden's most important political duty is domestic. He's got to unify America. He's got to regain confidence in American society at large. And, Kevin, you know as well as I do, foreign policy begins at home. You've got to settle your home front, and then you can go and fix the fences and travel in the rest of the neighborhood.
Now, the team is good in the Biden administration. They know Singapore and Southeast Asia well, and they're deeply respectful, whether it's Blinken or whether it's Sullivan or whether it's obviously Campbell. And we wish them well, and we want to see them more and more active in the wider region. Turning to a couple of questions we've got. One is from a person called Janelle. And Janelle asked this question: how do we respond to Min Aung Hlaing's ASEAN agreement to the 5-point consensus that he put on ice when he returned home caveating it with the need to have stability before he can carefully consider ASEAN's suggestions, quote unquote, as he framed them. ASEAN put a lot of effort into the 5 points. I saw the work on the ground. Yes. Tough. You took some tough decisions in having the general there. And then he had some less consonant remarks to make upon his return to Yangon or Naypyidaw. I can't remember where now. How do you see this unfolding, Minister?
Well, I think it will be a long and difficult journey, and there will be a lot of toing and froing and bargaining. So frankly, I'm not too surprised at his comments, but I don't think that can be used as an excuse to just sit still and not do anything. So he knows that the other ASEAN leaders in the 9 countries are serious and focused on this. He knows that there's consensus in the rest of ASEAN on what needs to be done. He knows that there is a plan, there are certain expectations, and that he can't just use this as an excuse to obfuscate or to filibuster. And he would also know, in the end, for Myanmar and even for his own political objectives, it's better for him to engage actively with and in good faith with ASEAN, rather than to just stonewall us. And then he will be left all alone, isolated from the entire world. So this is still, work in progress. I don't want to jump the gun in. I don't want to make things more difficult through megaphone diplomacy, but I would say from my direct observation and direct interaction with him, and I used to interact with him even before, on several occasions. He is the commander-in-chief of the Tatmadaw. The Tatmadaw does feel entitled to rule. The Tatmadaw, in fact, has been a critical part of the body politic of Myanmar. And in my comments earlier, I said, in fact, what we witnessed in the last decade was power sharing. And the biggest question actually is how and when and with whom, hopefully, he will be able to make arrangements for power sharing with civilian side of the house. Because it is clear that if you look at the young people in Myanmar today, Myanmar is one of the most internet-connected societies that I know of in Southeast Asia. Paradoxically, it was the previous government, before the NLD, that made cheap internet mobile access available. And I think if you ask Facebook, they will tell you that it's one of the most Facebook nations in the world. What that means is that the young people got... No, check on that. I mean, don't take it on faith from me. We should ask Mark Zuckerberg that. But if you look even at our own Facebook feeds and the people who participate in it, there is, in my view, there is a disproportionate participation by young people from Myanmar. So the point is, the difference between 2007 or even 98 compared to now is that you have an active, informed, and mobilized young people. And the other point is the demographics of Myanmar lean towards the younger generation. So it is different. And I hope he's listening and taking good and accurate advice. And he will understand that he does need a new modus vivendi. And the road that they were on for the last 7 decades is a dead end. If you look at Southeast Asia, all of us, if you look at the 9 of us, first, we were able to achieve national identity and unity, despite even the local diversity. Second, we were able to give security to our people. Third, we were able to give economic opportunities to our people. And look what's happened across Southeast Asia. And for Myanmar to be stuck in a time warp 7 decades ago is a tragedy, especially when you know the people of Myanmar and you know how hardworking and disciplined and friendly and imaginative and industrious they are. They deserve so much better. So anyway, I may be engaged in wishful thinking, but I hope he can see that he does need a new road. And you can't just double down on repression and the use of force.
Yes, it strikes me that demography delivers him a dead end if he's not very careful.
Yes.
That's my observation, not putting words in your own mouth. It'd be very smart to reflect on his part the successful transition out of the new order period in Indonesia and the transition of power from TNI to a civilian polity and what happened over time. Different countries, different environments, I understand that, but these things are doable if we were to reflect more widely in our regional neighbourhood, whether it's from previous military rule in Korea, Taiwan, or in Indonesia, and here as well. Another question has asked about the role of the United Nations, Minister, and that is the UN has a doctrine of responsibility to protect, adopted obviously after Srebrenica and after the tragedies in Rwanda. Do you have any reflections on the applicability of this doctrine to Myanmar's circumstances and more broadly, the role of the UN in dealing with the current crisis? And how is that calibrated with ASEAN?
Well, I'm not prepared to wade into its direct applicability to Myanmar at this point in time. You may or may not be familiar with our views on R2P, or responsibility to protect. As you said, it really came out of a concern that people needed to be protected. And the primary responsibility for protecting people must lie with your local government. And we should not be living in a day and age where we witness genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, or crimes against humanity. And if you look at the still evolving, and I emphasize still evolving debate at the United Nations, there is also a caveat that it should be something which is invoked very, very carefully. It must involve the United Nations Security Council. It must not be an excuse for external interference, because with the few exceptions that you've mentioned, in fact, the rest of history is replete with examples of spectacular failures when external solutions were imposed by external parties. My own sense of Myanmar right now is that external intervention is neither practical nor helpful. I believe reconciliation and dialogue has to be within the people of Myanmar themselves. And therefore, we are focused on helping that process of reconciliation, good faith negotiation to occur, rather than to invoke other specters which would press some very sensitive buttons in Myanmar. So I'm just explaining why I'm so cautious on this note, but I have not yet given up on bringing parties together and getting good faith negotiations going. We will, within ASEAN, that's certainly our priority.
For the UN Special Representative, and when we have finally appointed an ASEAN Special Envoy, do you have a sense of how the two could work together?
Well, I know Christine Bergener very well. I mean, we've been in touch for several years now. She has also done the hard work of engaging all parties. She has also had great patience, and you do need great patience in this job. Right now, in fact, I think she's somewhere I think she's in Thailand, or she's certainly based herself now in Southeast Asia. I would expect the ASEAN envoy to work closely with her and hopefully, be two elements of accord that would be able to reach out to and engage the military authorities in Myanmar. But I don't want to be prescriptive at this point in time, except to tell you that Christine has my vote of confidence. And I'm sure the ASEAN envoy will work with her.
The final question as our time draws to a close, Minister, is I think all of us have been moved by the extraordinary developments in India recently and
Yes.
with the impact of COVID-19 there. And most of us have felt fairly powerless to assist, to be quite honest, as simply in my NGO capacity. What do you do? Who do you write to? Which NGOs do you fund, etc.? Do you have any wider thoughts on how the international community can be more supportive of India at this particular time? It's a hard one. It's largely domestic, but the needs appear to me to be very great.
Well, again, I don't want to be prescriptive, but let me go back to what I do know. The variant B16172, first identified in India, we now know it is more contagious than the original form that was circulating last year. It may or may not give more severe disease. That part's not settled yet. But really what happened in India is that when you get an avalanche of cases, even people who can and should be safe will not be safe because you overwhelm the medical facilities. To run out of oxygen and ventilators and the necessary drugs which you need in ICU is really a tragedy. So it is in fact a salutary warning to all of us that this can happen if we let our guard down prematurely before vaccines have been able to raise our overall level of immunity. So the first point is this just shows you the power of exponential spread of a pandemic. The second point is that vaccination is essential, but you can't vaccinate yourself out of an exponential crisis. So you've got to dampen down that. And what it means at a practical level is all the social distancing measures, masks, and in proper masks, because we now know that it is spread through aerosols and not just through droplets, which is what we had presumed last year. Taking precautions on ventilatory systems, making sure the number of people meeting in rooms with poor ventilation, all these non-pharmaceutical measures, which in fact have been around for centuries, will need to be applied for at least the next 2 years until we can get our general immunity up. In the meantime, India has acute needs. In the case of Singapore, we've supplied oxygen, we've supplied cryogenic tankers, oxygen cylinders, oxygen concentrators, and the rest of it. But India is such a large country. Anything that we can do, we will do. But it's a massive scale problem. So we will continue to support, and Australia has also been very supportive of India.
Yeah, and all of us rightly so. I think we do grieve as members of the wider Asian family when we see such evidence of suffering. So as we grieved when we saw the outbreak of this in Wuhan originally, and the impact on people in China, innocent civilians caught by the disease. Vivian, thank you so much for your time. You've been very generous with this. You're a welcome guest with us at the Asia Society. I always enjoy discussions with you, my friend, because you're one of the most intelligent and informed foreign ministers in the world.
Thank
you. You understand what's happening, and you not just read your brief, but you actually dig into what I describe as the necessary technical details. So it's always a privilege to talk with you, but also then to take that information and apply it to the conceptual challenges we face about trying to make this crazy international order of ours more effective than it currently is. So thank you so much. We look forward to being with you again.
Yes.
And all the best to the good people of Singapore in navigating the challenges ahead. Thank you for being in our public session.
Thank you. You've got many friends out here.
Thank you.